All right, I wanted to put a response video up there to Haas USMC's squad level tactics training video on L-shaped ambush. He covered 3 different types of ambush in his video. I think you'll see it in the description here below where this video is a response to something. It's a good class, pretty decent standard infantry stuff. I want to go into a little bit more of an in-depth explanation on how the L-shaped ambush works in a relatively conventional enough infantry setting that it would also apply to irregular units coming or going. Okay, so we're not necessarily taking sides in this. I want to explain both aspects of how leadership elements tend to work, how the command elements and the fighting elements tend to work in the course of an ambush. The L-shaped ambush, when we talk about near ambush and far ambush, and we get into what's an advanced or a basic infantry tactic, a lot of times the more time somebody spends in the infantry, more time somebody spends learning this stuff, it becomes relevant to other aspects of military combat operations. My last several years of service, I was a low-level line leader in a combat engineer unit, and so our application of this sort of thing is also going to involve engineer elements, and I'm going to talk about that in the course of this. So the engineer elements are basically going to deal with barriers, mines, booby traps, and then counter-mine, counter-ambush type stuff. And you need to understand these elements of it because this is where a lot of times the infantry-only mindset screws up. And it definitely goes bad if somebody's infantry training was through the course of a non-combat MOS. Because a lot of times you will get the abbreviated version of the training, not because anyone's trying to shortchange you in the world, but because of the time constraints on the training courses, even within the military, especially when you're dealing with personnel who are not necessarily direct combat type personnel, but may be expected to accompany a patrol either on a patrol that may become ambushed or in an ambush crew. So I'm going to talk about that also from the Marine Corps perspective, where we would say that all Marines are a rifleman, all soldiers in an army are a basic soldier. With all Marines being a rifleman, that means you would be expected to participate in these types of operations regardless of your MOS, because in the Marine Corps, at least, it's entirely plausible that expert infantry people may be pulling personnel out of the bases to act as riflemen in these types of operations. In quasi-civilian type operations, things are going to work very differently, but you may have, let's say, within the aspect of a survival group or a militia or a local defensive group, you'll have your full-time tactical people, your full-time experts, and then you're going to have non-expert people who are brought in to fill these things in. So I'm also going to go over aspects of how the leadership elements will work in this. Now, as Haas USMC explained, an L-shaped ambush is going to be an L shape, roughly. There's the short side of the L, which I'm representing here, and then a long side of the L, which is represented here. We would assume that the group that's being ambushed is reasonably competent. They have some ideas how to spread out. They have some ideas how to take a patrol stop. But there is also going to be some behaviors that happen whenever a group is moving that just tends to be normal on that. The other thing we need to understand is that an ambush may or may not be conducted while the enemy is moving or stopped. That sort of depends on a local tactical considerations. You may set up the ambush ahead of time and then wait for the enemy to move into the ambush, or you may observe the enemy in a location and then move your people into place to conduct an ambush as an attack. But there's a few differences on that, and I don't want to get too much into the semantics of it, but understand that the L-shaped ambush or attack may be conducted where it's planned ahead of time, or where you showed up someplace and you notice that the enemy is sitting still and you feel that you could set up the attack as an ambush, as the L-shaped combat action, whether the enemy is moving or not. That's one of the things to understand. Now, I am going to explain this from both standpoints, and it probably takes more than 10 minutes to do it correctly. So if you have a short attention span, I'm sorry, that's too bad. This takes longer to explain. So we've got the Green Force versus, let's say, the Coyote Tan Force. The Coyote Tan Force is on patrol, or they may be stopped. It's going to work the same way either way. And the Green Force, in their L shape, this could be done as a mirror image or whatever. The short end of the L may not necessarily mean fewer people or less firepower than the long end of the L, but it does mean that people are less spread out. A lot of this has to do with the fact that we need this short side is going to have a lead element. That's not necessarily a command element, but it's the leader element because these are the people who start the fight. Okay? It's a lead element that by default is the group that starts a fight. Because they are the people that are going to be coordinating the start of the fight, and they may need to communicate with each other more directly, more discreetly, they need to be physically closer together. This is also where somebody's going to be in control of whatever the most casually producing weapons that group happens to have available to them. In the case of the little army men thing, we've got a rocket launcher, we'd have some machine gun type of some sort, and we might have an observer who's in control of some sort of a distant artillery or mortar or something like that. Get a little guy throwing a grenade. But basically, these guys need to be in control of a casualty-producing weapon. The other reason for this to be a relatively competent and responsible leadership element is because from this standpoint, their arc of fire needs to be very clear and very well known because it's possible for that arc of fire to reach into friendly forces. And so they need to be in communication with the command and a lead element. They need to be the guys that are really in control of the initial contact with the enemy. And the leadership elements here need to be with some very disciplined shooters who are going to maintain control of those weapons and not go berserk and not have their arc of fire reach into friendly forces. The other thing I like to have is a runner who goes back and forth from the actual command element so that he has a pretty good idea where all these guys have placed themselves and then can be in direct communication with your gunners or your mass casualty weapon producing weapons. He's in communication with these guys to make sure that this guy's arc of fire doesn't reach over too far. So we want a small number of relatively competent leadership quality people on this. Now, when I talk about your, I'm not going to say lower level, but it's usually lower ranking guys, maybe a bunch of non-combat personnel under the command of a corporal or even a specialist or just a senior PFC. They're going to spread out along here. This is a spread out thing because not only are they trying to produce enemy casualties, but they're going to have to cover a bit more territory. They need to be able to cover some territory. They need to be able to establish a line of defense where they have control over what's coming up and they have eyes on the enemy, but given the terrain what it is, they may or may not have eyes on the enemy all at the same time, but they do need to control a full line of territory. The other thing that I suggest when you're conducting an operation like this, your intel is going to be a small crew with what I call a restricted rules of engagement. This is usually going to be your actual command element, okay? Not necessarily your Johnny on the spot NCO who is the guy that starts the fight and has that magic of the combat instinct in him. He's going to be the guy who's at the leg of the L, or the bottom leg of the L. Over here, you're going to have an intel group, and you're going to have an actual command. Part of the reason for this is They may need to have access to outside communication, and we would like it optimally for them to have eyes on the enemy first. Let's say the enemy has a direction of movement through here. These guys are going to be the decision makers on whether or not the ambush is completed, or for whatever reasons, you're going to let that enemy movement, just let that patrol go on to another place. You're waiting for a more important enemy. You're waiting for maybe a better situation. Maybe you're waiting for a little bit less strong of a patrol. So this rear security is going to serve two purposes. One, if this patrol, for whatever reason, changed directions, it was coming up on the wrong side of the barrier to endanger these guys, then these guys have a restricted rules of engagement. They're going to engage. These guys will probably have to change position to back these guys up. The reason we have a restricted rules of engagement here is we really don't want, as the enemy's moving through here, we really don't want that gunfight to start here. We just want these guys to have eyes on the enemy, and then communication with the rest of our elements, usually by radio. Over here, we've got an observation and command unit. Again, it's a second commander, maybe a commander in training or something like that. Snipers. These guys are not mobile. They're just kind of going to be, hopefully, at a vantage point that's above the entire area. They're going to be the guys that would perhaps walk the fire in, if you're calling indirect fire. They'll remain in a relatively hidden position. Their rules of engagement, because their arc of fire may include friendly forces, they are to engage point targets only with their rifles or machine guns. They are to engage a known enemy point target only. They are not to do searching fire. They are not to do area fire. They are not to go berserk. These guys, if you really have a discipline issue with them, make sure they don't have anything that's going full automatic. That's rifles only. And they're primarily there. They're going to be there for the artillery spotting. Now, these guys, their job will be to say, yeah, start the artillery. It's these guys who walk it into place, because these guys may have limited visibility on the entire kill zone. So these guys need to be at a vantage point. The other thing they may do, as the enemy goes to escape out this way, they may engage the enemy out there, or they may not. That's a judgment call on their fault, because if the enemy consolidates at a retreat location, they may be able to outflank these guys. So these guys are going to have a semi-restricted rules of engagement. So over here, we've got the bulk of our forces, or at least the guys who are spread out. Their rules of engagement are to begin firing after these guys have started firing. They don't start the fight. The only time somebody might do it, he might be on a radio, he might scream. If somebody in the enemy element has spotted one of these guys, they may be trying to take a pot shot or throw a grenade. They may have a conference over here. Your unit discipline will be one on whether or not these guys ought to just take cover until the ambush has begun, or whether they should engage at that point. But you want somebody who's basically just going to follow orders and engage when they're told to engage. So that's the ambushing crew. That's a description of the ambushing crew and their jobs. So we've got an intel unit. They should be the ones with eyes on the enemy first as the enemy moves through here. They are going to be the ones who will make an overall decision whether or not everybody else is going to move forward with it. If for some reason they decide that you are not going to move forward with the ambush, all of these guys remain in hidden positions. They're not to engage. They're not to initiate fire. The only time they might fire is if somebody gets up close and it's a self-defense situation. These guys will withdraw from the enemy path of travel, and we're going to have some barriers up here to slow down the enemy path of travel. That gives these guys time to withdraw, and they will choose not to engage the enemy. As far as preparing the area, okay, let's assume you've got either the ability to prepare the area, or you've taken time, you have some idea of how the area goes. Your guys are in place. You've got an enemy path of travel. You're going to need to have at least some level of area preparation. and natural terrain features that are conducive to an ambush. Now we can go over natural terrain features conducive to an ambush in another video because it's going to be pretty complex. But when we talk about that, we want to be able to use some barriers within the realm of conducting the ambush for two reasons. One, we want to be able to stop or delay the enemy action. And then we also want to be able to channel their movement someplace, basically where they won't overrun our forces. So I'm going to talk about the barriers in the beginning of the next segment.